Hi, everyone. My apologies. Just trying to wake you guys up. My name is Alan Rutledge, and I work at a company called TrendMD that provides article recommendations for more than 4,000 journals. We work with 7 of the 10 largest scholarly publishers in the world. We collaborate with scholarly publishers, and they add a single line of our JavaScript code to their website. And that shows 10 similar article links at the bottom of the page. A very interesting survey recently conducted by Tracy Gardner and Simon Inger polled 40,000 researchers and asked them what tools do they actually use to help them find the most relevant, interesting content for their research. And they found that the single most important tool that everyone used was related articles. It even edged out search. The problem here in academia is that the articles that are most relevant to your readers are buried in the 8,000 new articles that are published every 24 hours. Bottom line is that the articles are not reaching their intended audience to the extent that they could be. The net effect is that for fields like medicine, this means that you have a 14-year gap between when you have a medical breakthrough and when doctors are actually aware of that medical breakthrough. Within that gap, you have a lot of unnecessary deaths and suffering. And to the extent that we can enable publishers to accelerate the rate at which humanity's knowledge disseminates, we can shorten that gap, and the more that the scholarly publishing industry can reduce aggregate human suffering levels. At least that's the way we frame it. Our recommendation system uses a combination of text similarity and collaborative filtering. The collaborative filtering works very similar to how the people who bought this also bought this. Product recommendations work on Amazon. Collaborative filtering is a fancy way of saying that you group readers into clusters based on their reading behavior. And when a couple of individuals from a reader cluster looks at a particular article, we then go ahead and show that article to other members of that reader cluster. Recommendation systems fundamentally alter how readers interact with content and the amount of content that they consume. And so by getting readers to consume more content than they would normally otherwise, we're able to help publishers increase their readership. The similar article links that we show on websites is broken into 2 sections. So on the left, you have non-sponsored links. These point to content within your network of websites. And on the right, you have sponsored links, and those point to content in other publishers' networks. Non-sponsored links allow you to cross-promote traffic between your websites within your network of websites, and this increases the page views per visit. Sponsored links, on the other hand, allow you to get new readers from other publishers in the TrendMD network. TrendMD is very unusual in that the readers we refer to publishers end up viewing significantly more articles than any other traffic source by a 45% margin. We recently published a peer-reviewed study that uncovered that a statistically significant correlation exists between TrendMD traffic and Mendeley saves. There already exists a wealth of evidence to suggest that when you have an uptick in Mendeley saves, this correlates with an uptick in citations. So we have reason to believe that an uptick in TrendMD traffic ultimately contributes towards an uptick in citations. In addition to enabling publishers to grow their readership, we enable publishers to help understand where their readers are coming from, which articles are attracting the most new readers, and in which third-party websites is their content actually trending. Trendemnity was made for researchers in mind by researchers. So my co-founder Paul was a clinician scientist, and Gunther Eisenbach founded the open access publisher JMIR. Matt Cockerell was the managing director of Biomed Central. And I, myself, have a very severe autoimmune disorder. So I am allergic to pretty much all the food in the room over there. I'm allergic to 90% of the foods you guys can eat. And it was out of the frustration of the literature review process, of me trying to understand why my immune system was attacking my organs, that Trendemnity was created. So we have a little time left over at the end, and so some additional things I'd like to cover with you guys are the near-term plans we have to improve the quality of the recommendations, and then some of the more interesting questions publishers have asked us. So for starters, we've been building a plagiarism detection system, and our goal is to make it freely available to all the publishers out there. And our goal is to aggregate as much content so that we can have the highest quality plagiarism detection. One of the problems that we're struggling with that will be a couple years away is it's one thing to detect plagiarism that's on the basis of copy and paste. It's another thing to do plagiarism detection on the basis of people stealing ideas. And there's a lot of ways addressing it, but that's much further out. We're also trying to have a trust graph. So with Google, they assign a spamminess score to every single website in their index. So they have a basket of high-quality sites like Stanford.edu and Harvard.edu, and a basket of low-quality sites. And the degrees of separation that your website is from those basket of websites in terms of backlinks determines its spamminess score. Similarly, we would like to have a system where if you co-author papers with someone who has a very sketchy background of having a lot of retracted papers, your trust score should be lowered. Conversely, if you publish an article that you co-author with people who are very high trust, they have no retracted papers, they have a lot of citations, your trust score should go up. And we believe that over time, this whole crisis of reproducibility, where people don't know what's real anymore, that the trust graph can help make the recommendations more trusted and more useful to researchers. One of the more interesting questions that we've received from publishers is, why don't we just build a recommendation system in-house? It's a very good question. In fact, many of our customers actually have their own recommendation system in-house. But it's important to understand that we're not just a recommendation engine, which we, in our minds, we view that as commodity. We are a community of publishers that are cooperating with one another, and they're trading traffic with one another to everyone's mutual benefit. That is not something that any publisher can do on their own for reasons of trust. The way to think about us is that we're a neutral Switzerland clearinghouse of traffic between the publishers. So you can build a recommendation system on your own that will help you recirculate traffic within your network of sites, but you cannot use that system to gain new readers from other publisher networks because they simply won't use a recommendation system. The single most interesting question I've been asked by publishers is, why on earth would I ever want to send traffic to a competing publisher, right? We're competing with them over customers. We're competing with them over circulation. Why should I ever want to send traffic to a competing publisher? The reality is you don't have to. You can customize your recommendations. You can have it where your traffic only flows to certain publishers that you don't view as competitive. And those publishers that you block in your recommendations can also do the same to you. But it's important to understand that everyone here, as a publisher, is required to show bibliographical reference links by their articles. You're already sending traffic to other competing publishers, and you're getting nothing in return. Why not get something back in return? The closest analogy I can think of this is that there's not a single person in this room who hasn't benefited from global trade. And we could just be asking, why should any country want to trade with another country? A couple hundred years ago, we were stuck in this mercantilist mindset that the goal is to hoard as much wealth and material as you can, and all the trade deals should be very lopsided and exploitative. And the net result is that there's stagnation of growth across nations. And we know that this whole idea of mercantilism is fundamentally, demonstrably false, that when you have cooperative global trade, all countries grow as a result of it. And it's also important to understand that readers' fragmented bits of attention are not all created equal. When you have a reader and they first come to your site, that's when their attention is most valuable. And over time, when they struggle to find the paper they're looking for, they eventually, their attention wanes and they leave your site. So their attention at the tail end of their visit is significantly less valuable than the attention at the beginning of their visit. And if a reader chooses to click on a sponsored link to leave your site, that means that they've already seen non-sponsored links that go to your existing content, and they've chosen not to click on it, which means that their attention span is already tapering off, and they're going to move onto the next website anyway. So you might as well get something in return. The key paradigm shift that needs to be understood here is that when we fulfill the needs of a reader, we're not just filling up a bucket with water, we're lighting a fire. None of this is mutually exclusive, it's not a zero-sum game. We are no longer stuck in the Gutenberg press era where readers are trapped in print offline journals. They're online and they can leave whenever they want, and they do leave whenever they want. And high tides raise all boats. So the more we as a publisher ecosystem can collaborate with one another and trade traffic, we take our users that are about to leave our sites and we get something back in return, the more that everyone succeeds, including, and most importantly, the reader, and the more we as a collective whole accelerate the rate at which humanity's knowledge advances. Thank you. So help me out. I don't understand how this goes from here, but if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'm game. Or just drop us a line.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering on what were your thoughts about gapping the breaching the divide between different disciplines. That sometimes, they might refer to the same method or the same idea with in slightly different terms, and they might be unaware of developments in neighboring fields. So their own networks and their own, curated recommendations might be exclusive. So I was wondering if you think that a system like this can help communities that are in different disciplines come into contact with one another, and what would be the way for that? Thanks.
That's a really good question. This system was intended for that very purpose. So my brother does a lot of neuroscience research out of UCL on happiness. So he's able to quantify and model people's moment-to-moment happiness changes as they gamble or they're addicted to something. And what I found so interesting is that that field where he sits simply would not exist unless he had cross-pollinated ideas from biochemistry, neuroscience, behavioral economics, and so on. And the future of research is that you have a lot of fields that are very well established, like physics, where all the low-hanging fruit is gone. So the only way to innovate and get your PhD is to cross-pollinate different disciplines. And to the extent that we can help contribute to that, that would be ideal. I think it's a non-starter idea to be trapped in a very small, narrow discipline, when the reality is when you cross-pollinate these ideas across disciplines, you can have an innovation that doesn't take foot in one field, but it explodes in another field. Does that answer your question? Sorry, say that again? So there's two ways of interpreting that question. Help me out here. So can a user affect the recommendations? Absolutely, that's the basis of collaborative filtering. But presumably you're referring to, can the user customize the type of recommendations they'd like to see? Sorry, say it again?
It could either be customized or could the users have more direct inputs or whatever. But of course you could be careful with that.
Yeah, so currently we don't do that, but that's on the roadmap. We would love it if people would give very granular control, if they had very granular control over exactly what type of content they want to see and what content they didn't want to see. Yeah.
And of course you can leverage on that.
Yeah.
I think there was a question down the other end.
Thank you. So, the idea of a really effective recommendation engine, makes a lot of sense, obviously. The thing that I struggle with a bit is when you said that a publisher can essentially manipulate it, because by blocking certain kind of recommendations, and that, to me, that just feels like you're undermining the sort of the value of the whole thing by allowing that kind of gaming of the results. So, what's your thinking about that?
Honestly, it makes me feel very uncomfortable when people tamper with recommendations. But I think the important thing to understand is that we exist there to solve first the needs of the publisher. And by solving the needs of the publisher, we're able to reach the readers and solve the reader's problem. And it's important we have our parties straight about that. I think the other thing I would say is that the reader at the end of the day has to decide what they want to click on. And they're not going to click on something they're not interested in. And if they don't find what they're looking for, they will leave for other websites. So we strongly encourage publishers to split test. Run the experiment. Don't trust us. Run the experiment. See what you find. We find that publishers that have the least restrictions on their traffic flows end up getting the most out of the system. Yeah.
Hi. Are you worried about rendering invisible the interesting stuff? I mean, most scientists are below average, or at least average or below. Many are really quite crappy. And they, by their choices, they will be rendering increasingly through convergence some potentially very interesting science into irrelevancy. So I worry about reputation engines, as I do in Amazon wanting me to buy a particular set of shoes, driving my choices to avoid outliers and interesting stuff. How do you think about that?
I worry about the same things you do. I worry about the filter bubbles that we're trapped in. I worry that algorithms are ultimately determining what we look at. And the reality is, the answer to your question is, I don't know. I think it's important that we start with the baseline assumption that the recommendation system that we built is terrible, and that over time it gets progressively less and less terrible. And that there's no one silver bullet for solving all the problems of surfacing the right information that's the right balance of interesting and impactful to that particular individual. I think the only thing we can do is we can beat the problem to death with experimentation. We can run lots of experiments. I also think it's a false dichotomy to assume that there's manual work to do literature review versus algorithmic, and there's no middle ground. The way I look at it is that systems that combine human collaboration with algorithms ultimately outperform purely algorithmic systems and purely human systems. And so one of the ways of addressing the problems you raised is you have a lot of people that are adding metadata to the articles, so having really good tagging, having a really good structure, a tree structure of the various tags, figuring out who is the identity of the individual, what is their career aspiration, what is their intent behind the particular research session that they're in, and then trying to figure out statistically what is the right part of the tree they should be fit into for this particular research session. So the short answer to your question is, I don't know. I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I would love to nerd out about it with you, because I don't have a lot of immediate answers. And the reality is we just need to throw a lot of things against the wall and see what sticks.
Well, just as a follow-up, if you look at the current activities on the likes of Twitter, where certain high-profile individuals will have millions and millions of followers following utter rubbish, the evidence that social convergence towards the lowest common denominator of acceptability is pretty strong. And so it is a tough problem to wrestle with, even to the point of saying, in your initial goals, you started out with a very, very laudable goal in doing this, make it easier to find stuff that was relevant to your particular interest. Do you think that the trajectory you've been on actually makes that easier, or just makes it easier to find stuff that has the right keywords that people are looking at? I mean, has it made an impact on your initial incentive to get into the field?
The short answer is I don't know. I think the reality is a couple decades from now, the jury will still be out on that. And that will be for the readers to decide for themselves. And I just don't know what will move the needle. And only the readers themselves know. In the short term, I have to do stupid hacks like optimizing for click-through rates, which I hate, right? Because that lends towards the whole sort of BuzzFeed-esque model, right? That, like, everything you see that's dysfunctional about our ad ecosystem, where the ads are really irritating, annoying, right? When you optimize blindly for a particular metric, you get trapped in local maxima. You're unable to find the global maximum. And I find that very frustrating. And right now, I'm limited by the amount of metadata I can aggregate on the users in a balanced way where they have transparency over what's being collected, and they can purge whatever record of metadata we're collecting on the readers, and that helps us improve the quality of the recommendations. That's one balancing act. The other balancing act is that the more you try and improve the quality of the recommendations and take into account all the nuances you mentioned, the more computationally expensive it gets. So you have to juggle between these very delicate balancing acts, where all of a sudden it's too computationally expensive to be practical, or it's too simplistic, and you end up making a bunch of very important papers invisible. It's a tough problem. I don't have a good answer. And my naive game plan is, over time, try and open up as much of the data as possible and leverage all the people out there that are significantly more intelligent than I am. And many hands will make light work. I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately. Go ahead, Roland. Yeah.
May not be as bad as it sounds, because another way of thinking of filter bubble is personalization. And that, the thing which help this bunch of people may help you. It may not be the best thing, but if I give you the best thing, it may not help you. So if I give you the most important paper, you just can't understand it because it looks like garbage to you, right? So the thing which helps you may be the thing which helps these guys may also help you.
That's true. One man's trash is another man's treasure.
Correct,
Who
correct.
are we to
So one has
judge?
to be careful with
Agreed.
the bubble. Is in some sense, what is useful to the eye of the beholder. But of course, one has to also recognize it's a bubble.
So I'm very agnostic as to, meaning I don't have a particular religiosity leaning towards one particular approach over the other. My attitude is just test all of these. Make sure the right feedback loops are in place. Make sure there's transparency around what data is being used. And make sure that ultimately the needs of the reader are being met. If we can solve the needs of the reader, ultimately we will solve the needs of the publisher and everyone. Any other questions? Guys, thanks so much.